Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to Concordia University's ForSpace. Thank you for joining us for the second event today as part of Serious Game Arcade, playing with the challenges of games that have a more serious purpose. And just to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube, live from ForSpace, and we are located here in unceded Indigenous lands. With ForSpace, we work with the university community, we help mobilize knowledge, daily activities, examining research questions and projects happening all across the university. Those of you joining us by Zoom, if you're new to the Zoom, your comments and questions are important. Please pop those into the chat. We'll read them out. Those of you here in the space, if you have comments, questions, we'll bring a microphone around so that everyone can hear. Okay, enough from me. It's now my pleasure to pass it back to Concordia, PhD candidate, communications. Also, our collaborator on this whole event, on many other events previous, Scott DeJong. Back to you, Scott.
Thank you so much. It's picking it up. Yeah, there we go. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. And once again, a big shout out to the ForSpace for helping manage this event, where you see the wonderful camera angles, the lighting, all of the tables set up with things on them. That's all them do a fantastic job. So big thanks to them. If you see them at any point, just thank them because they're incredible. Beyond that, we have a panel today titled, How Do Serious Games Open Up Possibilities Through Play? And just like this morning, it's not meant to be a typical academic panel where we have PowerPoint presentations going over our research. It's meant to be a conversation. We want to talk about what's going on, not just when we make games like we talked about this morning, but what happens after we make games. What kind of possibilities come from that, from research to outreach to changing public good or changing public mindsets, as some people might even argue. And so it's meant to be a conversation not just with us as panelists, including Burju online there, but also with you in the space and online. So please, if you have questions, pose them in the chat, and we'll make sure that between some of the conversations we're having here, to pause and check in if people in the room and or online have things they want to ask more about, ask clarity on, or just kind of bring up as points of conversation for us to reflect and ruminate on, okay? Awesome. With that being said, I would love if everyone could do a brief introduction. Just who you are. I also think it's really important to tell people your favorite game at the moment. It doesn't have to be favorite game of all time, but just favorite game of the moment. Who you are, favorite game of the moment, and then we'll go through our actual projects themselves. So I'll start. I'm Scott DeJong. I'm a PhD candidate in communication studies. I make and study games about disinformation and fake news. And my favorite game at the moment has been Ori and the Will of the Wisps, because I finally got to the sequel. And now we'll just pass it. We'll go there and around.
My name is Julie Tremblay. I'm a play and experience designer, so I work with organizations and educators in making games for change in playable media. So my favorite game is such a stressful question, but recently I finished playing Cult of the Lamb and I enjoyed it. So yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Kara Stone. I'm a game designer. I'm also an assistant professor at Alberta University of the Arts. My project here is called Known Mysteries, which is playable over here if you refresh the browser. And it is hosted on Solar Server, which is a solar-powered web server that hosts a games that I'm making. My favorite game right now, I've just reinstalled Marvel Snap because I've been traveling for the past week and having to kill a lot of time, and I get very easily obsessed with it. So I'm enjoying myself again. Yeah.
Thank you, all such good games. My name is Paul Darvazi. I lecture at the University of Toronto, occasionally at the University of Sherbrooke. I run a studio called Goldbug Interactive and also run the Serious Play Conference. And I think it would be a current tie between Hades, I'm not playing the second one, I'm playing the first one because I love the first one, and Oxygen Not Included.
Both very good suggestions. And then Burju online here.
Hi everyone, I'm Burju and I am a PhD graduate at Concordia University Design and Computation Arts, and I built two games, one analog board game and one digital game to teach sustainable development in the built environment.
Awesome. So we'll go in reverse order now. I want each of you guys to take 5-ish minutes max to kind of just talk about the most recent game that you've produced. So give some context for how does the game play, like how do you actually play it? what was kind of the goal of the project, and then any other pieces of information you think will be great to ground the discussion that we're moving into. So I don't know if you want to start us off, Burju, kind of going through those two games you made.
Yeah. So first, the general project I designed for my doctoral research was like an hybrid public installation that uses a digital AI augmented game which is projected onto a sculptural form to teach sustainability in built environment. So the project supported by the analog and the board game. On analog board game we designed called Next Gen Islands. So this game designed to test the didactic mechanics in a tangible and collaborative format. So we took the data from that analog game and projected it onto the digital one. So my project blends public eco art, interactive media, and serious games to raise awareness and provoke reflection onto the real world sustainability decisions. It's implementing AI, different AI technologies to question how these technologies use a lot of energy and how we can use them to something better for the world, to educate people and to raise awareness and to create all these discussions, and also to facilitate the consequences for our actions, maybe if we don't choose sustainable solutions. Yeah, thank you.
Burju, I don't know if you want to, what was it? Okay. I don't know if you want to expand just a little bit on kind of, you said that you're doing a lot of stuff with eco kind of change, and that's both in the game, but also the audiences you want to work with. Can you just expand a little bit on like who you're trying to have that game impact or influence and how you're doing that?
Yeah, sure. So the game we designed is for the general public use. So for example, we plan to implement it into a public space. It could be like a transportation hub, could be like it could be where people pass daily and like can have a little time to spare while they're waiting for a bus, for example, or metro. So the game is trying to attract like a diverse type of users in means of age, gender. So we try to design it as simple as possible, and also for people to play in a very short period of time, and offer them some sort of a visual aspect of the game. So it turned into a little bit more of a than game to actually a communication device between the public and maybe the designers, the policymakers, to show these ideas of sustainable ideas and share these ideas with the public, and see how public are reacting to these ideas and what are their priorities. Yeah.
Cool. Also, I think we're going to jump on some of those themes as we move forward, of like the difference between game and activity. I think I'm just getting some feedback there. And later on, but that's a great starting point, and I'll pass it over to Paul now.
Sure. The most recent game that we worked on at the studio and produced will not sound very serious. It's a dancing dinosaur game that we produced for Fred Rogers. It was for kids probably between the ages of 4 and 7. And it's based on a TV show called Alma's Way. We don't get it here in Canada. It's a PBS show in the US. It's a beautiful TV show inspired by the life of Maria from Sesame Street, who grew up in the Bronx. And it's about a young woman and her very kind of mixed group of friends in the Bronx. And she tends to solve her problems through thoughtfulness and empathy. And her little brother, Junior, loves dinosaurs. And so we made a game where you can choose a series of dinosaurs and have them dance. And now you're wondering, well, what purpose does this serve? And it's all for fine motor skills. We've designed it so that you start using fine motor skills on pads. We worked with experts that really kind of help guide us in terms of what motions are appropriate, what motions we can help kids use, and still advancing the cause of the PBS show. So it was a really fun game. It was incredible to work with our friends at Fred Rogers. And my partner Elisa was really kind of the force behind producing the game. And then prior to that, are we only about one game or two games?
Keep going, because I feel like you have a lot of games that I'd love people to hear about.
Okay, yeah. So I have shared Protection, which is the game that I showcased today. And because most of you have seen it and heard me talk about it, I'd like to talk about the game we made right before that, which was started at about the same time. And it's called SABS. And that was a fascinating project because we were hired by GIZ, which is the development arm of the German government. So it's the equivalent of US aid, but in Germany. And the game was designed to help Afghanis think more about reforestation. Afghanistan is the country in the world that is probably the most deforested and therefore one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. They tend to have excessive flooding and droughts because of the lack of trees, and the deforestation has to do with war and black market and all kinds of things. So we essentially were challenged to create a game that you could play on your phone that would simulate the economic life of an Afghani village, and to show them that through certain, sort of actions that they could take, that it was to their long-term economic benefit in order to reforest the area around their villages. And it was an incredibly complex project because we had to work with subject matter experts that were experts on soil, the types of trees, the purpose of the trees, and then on top of that, some of the challenges that we were confronted with was one, well into the project, we discovered that Afghani adults think that games are for children. So we had to kind of change the aesthetic of the game to be very realistic so we could pass it off as a simulator. But the problem with the realism was that most Afghanis have mid-level Android phones. And we had to make the game so that it worked with a mid-level Android phone while keeping the art very realistic. So there was a whole series of technical challenges around that. And one of the things that we wanted to promote through the game was the importance of including women in the decision-making, in the process of the reforestation. And then about late in the development, or sort of at one point in the development of the game, the Taliban took back over and started chasing away NGOs and reducing the role of women in public life. And so we had to adjust our game development accordingly. So that it was really challenging. We learned a lot, worked very closely with subject matter experts. In terms of the game's impact, well, we can talk about that in a separate discussion.
Yeah, I feel like that's something we might want to talk a little bit more about. Before you hand Mike over, I feel like there's also a tie we see in terms of like, Bruce, you're talking about how like a game in its development to completion shifted from being a game to being perhaps a public activity. And you're saying the same as reframing it or shifting it to the changing politics of the scenes that you're putting it in. And I don't know if you could speak a little bit more as someone who has made a variety of different games on topics from dancing dinosaurs to reforestation in Afghanistan. Can you speak a little bit to how, as designers, you can jump between topics so heavily and still produce what you would deem an effective tool in those spaces?
Yeah, I think it's the beauty of what we do. I think both my partner, Elisa, and I are people who love to learn. Always, and we like to be challenged in different ways all the time. That's why we've never really been interested in putting games to market. Our studio is a service studio, so that means we are hired to create games for people, because the alternate to that is to create a product and spend a lot of time marketing the product. And marketing is not our interest. It's not where we want to put our energies. We're people who love to learn, who love to create. And the beauty of what we do is that we're always learning from the subject matter experts that we deal with. And typically with the kind of relationship that we have as a studio with our client is they would hire us to create a game around a certain topic or a certain objective that they have. They will usually provide the subject matter experts. We will then do our own research, and not just research around the content, but the approach to the game, because we're not a copycat studio. We don't just kind of take an idea that we've seen in the wild and try to apply it. Because I have, sort of a foot in the academic world, I feel it's really important to see if there's been any empirical evidence to prove that our approach might work or might not work as part of the sort of service that we give our clients. Sometimes an idea that they have is not viable, and we want to change the idea in such a way that it would be based on the research that we do. And then they usually provide subject matter experts, and we debrief with them, we work with them closely. They usually enjoy the process because it's exciting for them to be part of a game design process. And I think a lot of people have game designers in them and they don't realize that. And we're very open to getting ideas from our clients and to working closely with them in ways that may exceed their expertise if they have good ideas about how to design the game or help us design ours. And so what that allows us to do is in those relationships, we can jump from subject to subject because of those kind of relationships and partnerships we have with the people that we work with.
Yeah, and I think, just going to reiterate, that all of you could be game designers if you didn't catch that line out of that in any capacity. I think we're going to come back to a lot of that, but if Kara, and I don't know if people listening will catch, there's kind of like a subtext across everyone here around like climate sustainability was an interesting kind of overlaying piece. Not that that's something you have to speak to right now, but I'm just saying I feel like your game will indirectly speak to that as you talk about it.
Yeah, my most recent game I put out at the end of last year. It's called Known Mysteries, and it's a climate science fiction game that follows a woman returning to her town, and it's a narrative with different endings and combines video footage and text as you navigate a different space. And kind of my goal with this game was to make a low carbon game, so trying to make it as small as possible. And kind of trying to highlight that as well in the way that the game is designed. So there's some elements like you could see, if you were to see the aesthetic of it, it's very compressed. It's pixelated into third, and it uses real found footage that I've edited and compressed, of course, into it. And it's broken down into different chapters, so it's not all downloadable at once, and more as well, which I can get into. And I came to this idea as I was thinking through how to work more in environmentalist media, not just in the themes like previous games of mine have done, but actually within the production process itself. And so I had decided a few years ago to follow some digital internet creators who were hosting their own websites on solar-powered servers. And so I set one up, and it's very small, it can only hold so much. And so, of course, I'm also making the game small for that. And it will host a series of games that are designed in this way, and kind of trying to experiment with designing games to be smaller rather than bigger, or more realistic, or higher graphics. And yeah, kind of working against a lot of things like game engines and stuff that aren't really concerned about the size of the output. So interested in that. And then, is there more to say about Known Mysteries? No. We could come back to it, but that's
I think it would be really helpful if you could spend a little bit of time talking a bit more about that solar server project, especially at a time where you're seeing big tech companies making nuclear power plants to fund their LLMs that are going into not just game design, but tech in general. And you're like, no, we're going to scale down and we're going to scale back. We're looking at a solar server as a place to host your game. So can you just expand on that just a little bit more for everyone?
Yeah, for sure. So the solar server is hosted on my apartment balcony. So I have a solar panel, an old car battery, and a Raspberry Pi, a form of microcomputer, and then a 32 gig SD card that hosts the website and the game on it. And yeah, I had started making it pre this boom of AI, but I think, of course, it is really relevant as there is lots of talk where I live in Alberta is trying to have more nuclear power to host more AI and more computing technology, and kind of getting bigger and bigger. And we see large companies that had commitments to renewable energy or going lower carbon completely throw that out the window, right? With the desire for more AI. So I kind of in a realm in which that I'm just really trying to feel good about making my own work, right? Like alongside it being renewable is trying to experiment with having things not hosted on Steam or iOS and like the servers that for the most part use fossil fuels to create energy for the servers. And yeah, it's been very fun to make and experiment with. And, it's not like I can recommend it or think it's like a large scale solution, right? It's just for my projects, as I'm an artist and I want people to play my work, and everywhere else you would play my work before, like on Steam or on the mobile app stores, you would have to consume fossil fuels to play them, right? And so I wanted to at least make it not mandatory when I'm like asking people to play my work to not engage with that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And as Julie's about to talk, I just want to remind people after this, we're going to open up space for some questions before we continue with our own. So if you do have questions that you're sitting on, maybe ruminate them on a bit further, because we'll have a moment for you to ask them both online and in person in a second. But Julie, please.
Fascinating. I work primarily in the space of games for cities, and so that's where the sustainability link is coming in. The last or most recent game that I've produced, and that's the one I'm showcasing today, is a game about, it's exploring the complexities of urban planning and mobility and the impact that urban planning has on the everyday life of caregivers. And so people who are in their everyday life taking care of their communities or their families, research is showing that the way our cities are organized and developed are creating a lot of blockers to make their life easy or pleasant, at least. And so this game is an analog serious game that simulates the sensations or the difficulties that the caregivers will face in a day or in their ordinary life, so to speak. It's meant to raise awareness on these issues and these realities that are often invisible, like their workload is invisible and the issues that they face is often invisible as well. And it's meant to also open dialogues and discussion between agents, civic decision makers, urban planners, hoping that, decision makers will make choices that will help caregivers.
Can you speak a little bit more on how the game actually opens up those conversations? Like, are there mechanics in the game, or are there spaces that you're introducing the game in order to do that?
So it's meant to be facilitated in a group setting where you have a session of at least 2 hours and the gameplay will last maybe an hour. The game itself will highlight the difficulties, and the discussion afterwards will have to be facilitated. And that's with the discussion that we're revising what was explored during the games in terms of like what issues did you observe, what challenges did you observe, and what connection can you make from the game to your real life community, and doing ping pong between problems and solutions.
Yeah, and then on that note of facilitation, I feel like anyone on the panel might be able to address this conversation, but since you're talking about it right now, is it facilitation that anyone could run? Like, could I pick up your game and facilitate it, or is it something that I would need to be trained in order to facilitate properly for your game?
We've made it in a way that it would be as easy as possible for anyone to pick it up. Most games that I've made before was the opposite, where I knew my facilitator was an educator or was someone who was a trained facilitator, and I knew they were subject matter experts. So when the game was designed, it's designed in the context of the session it's going to be facilitated in, and I know who's going to do it. So so the game can be complex because I know my facilitator is an expert in the matter. But for this specific project, we made it in a way that we're expecting urban planners or decision makers or educators to use it, but because we're not sure exactly who's going to use it, we had to make the game in a way that it can be self-explanatory and run on its own as easily as possible. So you do need to have some expertise or ease with running a group and framing the questions and framing the discussions to make sure that it goes in the correct direction. But it's
Yeah, but you're not providing that training. That's like that person should kind of have that ability to begin with.
Exactly,
Kind of piece, yeah. So we'll open up the space for any questions, if there are any online or anyone here who wants to kind of just jump on some of the topics that were just brought up at all before we move into a larger conversation at the table here. But just a moment in the room or online for that, if there are any. They're going to bring a mic to you, though, so don't just yell it out, because otherwise the people online can't hear you. I think they're grabbing one. It's coming.
We'll bring a microphone over.
Fantastic.
I've got one.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious about the process and the challenges, the opportunities of translating knowledge from different disciplines to game design. How do you go about creating the mechanics, the player interactions based on the knowledge that you're trying to impart from the game? And these are very different environments, sustainability versus deforestation. So the knowledge of the discipline to the game design. Thank you.
Does anybody want to address that first?
Yeah, I'm happy to quickly say something, but I'd love to compare notes. Yeah, I work with subject matter experts, so they give me the knowledge, and then the process of making it into a game varies depending on the project, but what matters most very often is at the beginning of the project, we establish our priorities in terms of like our learning objectives. What's your ideal scenario at 100% ideal game? What's your criteria of success at maximum? What's your criteria of success at mid-level? And what's your criteria of we failed? And it's a lot of iteration. We select of all the pool of knowledge. Once we have the success criteria, we're able to extract some key points and then put it into gameplay and then test it out and see if it works. And all the time we have to scope down. It's always way too complex at the beginning. I'm sure you've experienced this before. That's part of the fun. The iteration is what matters. And I will say one thing is, in terms of mechanics, my audience is always non-players. And so one of my first design question is, who are they? What is the context of playing? If they have not played before, if we have an hour with them, if they're impatient, if they don't know each other, if they don't speak the language well, then the mechanic needs to be super simple. And I know that I have a limitation in terms of, I will like take mechanics that they know really well. Like I've designed a game for elders before, and we knew from the start that the mechanic had to be a card game, because they know cards really well. We won't start playing something like Pandemic or Catan with someone who's never played before if we only have 30 minutes with them. And so for me, the mechanic will be almost the first thing to establish.
Bridget, did you want to add anything to that question?
Short answer I can add. It's like, so since I'm an architect originally, so this also works with the idea of everyone can design a game. So I try to like embed in some architectural theory in my game, for example, especially for the board game. So for example, when we talk about sustainability in built environment, we know the systems thinking approach is very relevant. So I try to use this as a core in my game. So so I built these like different systems and like different subjects so they can connect to each other, and like players can think about more than one aspect of the sustainability in a city. So I brought this with me from the architecture, my architecture side into the game design.
And you wanted to add something, Paul?
Yeah, it's such an important question. It's such an important question because often we're dealing with subject matters that have an enormous amount of information attached to it. So step one is prioritizing what is absolutely essential, right? And that has to be considered within the frame of how do we make this game good, right? Like how do we make it fun and entertaining? Because otherwise, why not just do a PowerPoint presentation? Like we have an impetus to be entertaining, and this is the crux of the serious game, learning game world, is that often they're like, okay, yeah, but it's not that great of a game, right? And what we're seeing is that because as game design becomes more pervasive, as more schools have game design programs, as games become more central to our culture, we're seeing games that are actually good games that advance knowledge. And somebody said today that that every game teaches you something, and I agree 100%. Like I think that every game to some degree is teaching us something. So rolling back to the question, I think it's important to prioritize. I think it's important to then, make sure that you're not sacrificing anything essential to the learning and objective of the game, but sometimes you do have to eliminate things because you can't deliver all the information. And the other thing that's really important about game mechanics, and this is why our world is very constrained. I mean, if you're putting an entertainment game to market, it's wide open. You can do whatever you want. I mean, once you decide on the genre and the style of game, you're constrained to some degree, and you're obviously constrained by budget, but we're constrained by subject matter, by learning objectives, by an audience that may not play games, right? That's a huge consideration. I know that when we created our board game, it had to be designed for an audience that doesn't play games. And one of the things that I think is essential to know is that the content and the learning you deliver or the information that you deliver is not just in the content, but in the form, in the dynamic and the mechanics, because sometimes that might be even the more essential learning. So when you are constrained in terms of, yes, making the game accessible through the mechanics that you choose, if and when you can, those mechanics should be able to reinforce the content that you're producing. And sometimes, to quote Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. Sometimes the way in which you conduct something is just as important or more important than the content that's being delivered.
I just want to jump in there as well, just as someone who just made some games in that space. I went to a conference once and I talked about media literacy games and games being used to talk about fake news and disinfo. And a professor, I'm assuming because it was an academic conference, asked me, they were like, so can you not just make a game that we teach to all kids and then they won't be disinformed? And I was like, no, I can't do that. It would be great if I could. I'd be like potentially really rich, and that'd be a fantastic tool, and we wouldn't have to worry about disinformation anymore, and life would be peachy. But it doesn't work like that, because to kind of the points that we're seeing come across the table, every project gets scoped either to the audience that you're working for or the specificity of that topic. Like media literacy is so broad, disinformation is so broad as topics that like when you bring in subject matter experts, they're also very focused on that subject. Like even in the domain of media literacy, there are people who focus specifically on like fact-checking skills, and that's their entire focus domain, right? And so in these game projects, in these interactive media, in these simulations, it's about making sure your scope is not just from like who the audience will reach, but what dimension of that topic you want to focus on, because you unfortunately can't do it all. No game, no tool, no media object can do it all. And it's about making that clear from the start when you're building those kind of limitations and directions to go in. And so thank you for the question. And I think we're gonna continue our conversation at this table, because part of the reason I framed this panel under the guise of like, what do they open up as possibilities, right? Is each of you has a game in the space today that is completed, whereas the group this morning had games in the space that were being completed, they were being designed. And so that last, even if it's that last 10%, it changes the game a little bit. It changes the project in some capacity, and it changes what you're doing with that project. And so I was wondering if we could speak a little bit to kind of what happens once a game's done. Do you just leave it there to collect dust on a digital shelf? Do you kind of market it for forever and forever and forever until you feel like it's no longer there? What is the after done part of a serious game project? And perhaps we'll start with Burju this time, and we'll make our way through the table kind of exploring that?
This is actually a great question. First of all, my game is like very far away from completion right now. But as I said, it's started as a game and like more like an eco art installation and turned it into a public communication tool within the public and the government and like policymakers and people who has saying in the city making maybe. So I think like after the completion, it would be used by the city and as a communication tool, as I said. So it's very interesting. But once my first prototype phase ended, I also found myself asking questions like, did the game, not just like, did the game engage players, but also what lingers after the game ends. So I found all these answers for that, but it's of course it's not on my hands only, so I'm just gonna go on and asking questions and trying to test the game in different contexts and find a maybe even different roles. I was thinking of the building it embedded in the game, like community oriented community situated in a specific communities in the city and adjusting it with their needs and like their way of living and so on. So I think it's a very evolving process. I don't think that game would never be completed in this way.
Yeah, why don't we just continue around the circle? But yeah, there's a piece there of some people will say maybe a game is never done. Maybe that's actually the answer here. I don't know for sure.
Well, whether the game is done sort of, I think you could, like a book or a painting, you could always dab and, add a new word. I think there's always a possibility to alter a game and improve it and change it, and it could drive you crazy. Fortunately, in my world, our clients have deadlines and I have to call it done when it's done. But in terms of what's funny is that we've had like the whole range. I've had games that we've put, that not us, but the client has put a significant amount of money into. I'd be surprised if 10 people played it, right? That it's basically been an exercise in futility. And then we've gone all the way to hundreds of thousands of players for some of the games we've created. And I think our Dancing Dinosaur game will likely be in the millions because it's going to be published on PBS Kids. So there's a whole range of outcomes. And I'm a bit cynical about it in the sense that my hope is always that people play the game, but I value the process as much as the outcome because you don't have control over that. And I think, especially if you're a commercial, if you're in the indie game space, that could be a really difficult, it's a very, very competitive space. You put a ton of work into a game and very few people may play it, right? There's a whole marketing element, there's a luck element, so it's something where if you are in, if you are in the space of making games, I think you should just love making games and hope for the best, and hopefully you've got a roof over your head and your bills are being paid.
Yeah, Known Mysteries is the first game that I've made for Solar Server. So it's been very interesting to see how it is after release. And unlike when I was hosting my games on big platforms, I have much more of a worry of like, oh, is it down? Like, I have to go check on it. Is the server working? And I feel like I have a lot more responsibility with it. So I actually feel much more present with the game post-release because of it, and because I see it every day on my balcony, than if I had just put it on, iOS or something. And I'm thinking with Solar Server that part of the idea will be that games are just up for a certain amount of time. So instead of having like an ever-expanding archive where one day there's like 20 games that were made for it, they'll just be up kind of until the next one is ready to be up. And then that one will be up for a couple of months or a year or 2 years or however long until the next one. And part of this is to have kind of more ephemeral media but also just so, like, in a practical sense, that the server doesn't have to grow and grow and grow for kind of no reason. And I kind of feel like when I usually put out work, as soon as I'm done, I'm like, well, it's everybody else's. Like, it's not really my business anymore. Part of that is because I don't make games that are trying to persuade somebody of something or educate somebody of something. I see myself more coming from the arts, and that's often more about expression or relation. And yeah, I have a lot to learn in that kind of more design field. But one thing that I did do this time upon release is I worked with Ben Abraham of Afterclimate, and we did a study on what the carbon emissions were of making known mysteries, and we compared it to other indie studios and AAA studios. And the whole report is up on the website on solarserver.games for those of you who are interested in that kind of, like, you know, CO2 emissions and seeing things like that. But long story short for that is, like, the biggest carbon emission from making it is, like, once I flew to GDC to talk about the project, and that was over 50% of the whole project's emissions, and about 4 people worked on the project, and I flew once one way, and so I was like, that's really bad. So that's kind of along the line that Ben Abraham and others are working for, that are calling for kind of like a carbon emission stamp for games to state, like, what their emissions were, so we can find that, like, more publicly available. And I thought that was a really great idea. So that is something that I will be tracking, like, post or as I am making the games for Solar Server. Yeah. Just checking my notes.
I love when once a game is complete and launched, I love this part because you move from design questions to impact questions. And so I stop asking, how do I transfer knowledge into play? How do I reach my learning objectives with this experience I'm designing? You have these answers, you figured it out, you release it into the world, and now it's about what impact will I make? How much of an impact can I make? And also, will people use it the way I expected? No, they won't. So how is it gonna transform as an experience, not just as an object, but who will use it? And for the Kier game, we're really there. We're like releasing this summer, and it's unpolished. It's finished, it's functional, it's reaching the learning objectives that we have, but it's unpolished. And we don't know if the people we're expecting are gonna use it. We are not sure if they're gonna use it, and we are not sure how, and we are not sure for what context and what they're gonna think. And it's exciting to see if this is what it's gonna be, and there's like a field of possibilities that is opening once you decide that it's complete enough, it can be released into the world.
Yeah, and I think for when you make a game, you don't actually know what that impact might be. Like, those impact questions sometimes are iterative in themselves. Like, you release a game, and then people you don't expect to be into it will, like, pick it up and talk about it. And I had this experience with, I made a board game about conspiracy theories meant for educators. And the most common person that reached out to me were military groups. And it was a complete, like, 180 of what I expected. But because I had used, like, simulation systems thinking style design, they were really interested in this idea of, like, can this game represent a disinformation war? And then some of them just wanted to use the game as a recruitment tool to get into classrooms. And it was a whole set of questions that then came to me as a designer that was like, I made this game as an educational practice, and now it's being used as a potentially military recruitment tool, when my entire goal was not even close to that use case. But because my design goal was to make a tool that's usable for the public, and I made it freely accessible, I can't stop that either, right? And so it raised new questions for me around that space. And as a scholar, I then began studying that. Like, why is there this interest? Why is there this direction? And I think there's a lot of directions that a game can take when we say the word's done with it. And so thank you all for sharing. And I want to open up the space again for questions. I think I see a hand, and we'll do the hand, and we'll check online. Just to make sure everyone's feeling included as well. But I think, yeah, there's a question in the room there, if we can get them on microphone.
Hi, thank you very much for the panel. I'm actually going to touch on a little bit of what you're saying and something I'm struggling with. I think that you've sort of reckoned with it on a more profound level, the idea of the environment, for instance, and the media that we're engaged in, video games. In and of itself, you know, it is consuming energy, the production of this sort of media tool. But also, I think there's like almost like a contradiction because you want people to play the game. The more people play the game, the more they consume energy. So the more popular it is, the more a carbon footprint sort of grows. And so you want it to fail from an environmental perspective, right? You don't even want to, you might not even want to make it, right? If you really want to be purely fair with your carbon footprint and just not have any impact. And so this kind of brings me to this other question where, you know, the impact of the video game. Right. How much of your games, whether it's environmentalism, whether it's Afghanistan and culture and women's rights and whatever the environment and so on, the impact, how can you tell if the impact is just a superficial sort of pat on the back, like, hey, I feel good about myself because now I know about environmentalism, but I'm not going to change anything in my life whatsoever, to something a little bit more profound where they're, you know, going to not consume as much plastic, or they're not, whatever the thing. So what are if any, what are the things that you found in your games that had the most tangible impact on its users? If you know, if you've monitored it, if you don't, well, you don't know. But are there any things that really particularly worked in any of your projects, for instance? So yeah, I don't know if that's clear.
I don't want to put you on the hot seat, Kara, but do you want to start answering that? Because I feel like that was a really interesting take on your game there.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I can't speak too much to impact on users because that's not what my project is about. But I really like your interpretation of, like, we do want to scale the audience or scale what the demand is. And it's interesting in After Climate's work, they see that the like AAA studios hit kind of a threshold that they just make huge carbon emissions for one game. And it's kind of like a studio size thing that he's still kind of figuring out why exactly that is. And of course, it depends where the user is in the world, what kind of energy they're using too, right? It's not guaranteed that somebody is using fossil fuels. Like here in Quebec, you're not going to be using fossil fuels if you're playing Solar Server because it's being uploaded through solar and it's being downloaded through hydro. So I think the idea of, and also my games will never be that popular that I have to like really think of it as like a large scale issue in the world. But I think that, you know, kind of a push for not only, you know, having it be at least partly on renewable energy, but also the design itself to be more minimal in the way that it's consuming carbon. So it isn't exactly equatable to another indie game that is still like much bigger because the energy consumption is higher. There are environmentalists that would argue like, well, it doesn't really matter as long as it is on renewable energy on both sides. So you can like have people play huge AAA games as long as we are fueling it with non-fossil fuel energy. But in terms of impact on its player, I feel like I haven't really been so invested in that in my game design career. I'm of course interested in it, but it's not my focus. And for this project, I felt very released from having to think about it, right? Having to be at a position where I, a solo game developer, am in a position to like educate or raise awareness about something or try to change somebody's behavior. I'm just being like, I am running it on renewables, and I think that the focus on the production portion is where a lot of change can happen beyond just in the renewable energy space, right? Like just ethical studio practices and so forth, whereas there's a lot to be said about that.
Did anybody else want to jump in on that question?
I can just quickly say that, yes, we have some impact. We have to measure everything because all the projects we've worked on were funded through public funding. And so And so we know that the minimum impact we have is that per individual, we're tracking what they're learning, if they're learning, what they're learning. And so we're looking at, are you, depending on the project, but like, are you learning what we want you to learn? What are you learning? Are you feeling more comfortable talking about urban planning, or are you feeling more comfortable being involved in discussions about urban planning? And we know that most projects is yes, to different degrees of percentages, but yeah. So at the individual scale, we're hitting the target there in terms of learning impact. What we don't know is, at the later stage, we don't know if these people are going back to their communities and taking actions to get involved in social or environmental sustainability movement. That we don't know. That's our greater wish for these projects, but we don't have a way of talking back with them, and so, yeah.
I can jump in here, or Burju, did you want to add something? Was that you trying to raise a hand? No, okay. I think it's really hard to determine efficacy when it comes to learning in general. Like when we're saying, like, if I ask you, like, when did you learn to read? There's not like a specific day or moment it happened, because it was all these incremental activities in our lives that led to that time when we could actually put letters to sounds to words to comprehension. And I think games fit into that same process in the same way, where like when someone asks me like, how do you know your game was effective, or how do you know your game was successful? It's a big research question too, because often you'll see these studies that are like, we tested people before they played a game, we tested them after, and then they learned something because the test after they answered the questions better. But I would argue that like I could put anything in that middle point and I would have success post. Right? And I mean, Robin can probably speak to this as someone working in testing educational games in that space. But the larger question then for me is efficacy, and kind of to what Julie was saying is like, comes down to what were my goals at the start of the project, and were those goals being met in the communities I was there? So now for me, when I'm looking at efficacy for a learning game that I'm making, I'm interviewing teachers after they've played the game, not for what the teachers learned, but do they see that game fitting into their curriculum? Did they see a change in behaviors in their classroom? Did they see potential for that game to be used again in that course? I'm looking at designing a research study right now for the fall, where we would have students play the game and then take journals for a month, and then play the game and take journals for a month, and see if having this kind of long-term study can see if that game keeps coming up in their lives. One of the things I was doing for a playtest of a game that takes 5 sessions to play, it's 20 minutes a session, is at the start of each, I'd ask them, and it was a week and a half between, give or take. I'd be like, did you think about this game at all between the last time we played it and this time? And one time the kid was like, yeah, my parents asked me what I did, and so I thought about it again. And the other time the one kid was like, no, I thought about the robot when I was falling asleep last night because I want to know what happens. It's a mystery game with a robot. And I also think, to like Kara's point, there's also an argument of like games as art kind of becomes a piece there as well, where the Solar Server is a practice that is asking the space of game design and game makers to rethink their practices, to think about why are we constantly trying to go more and more and more. Maybe we can scale back. Maybe we can be more eco-friendly and sustainable. So I think efficacy is not only project-based, but also how you see the game, and then how the audience that you're using is seeing it impact their life. Because there's no game that I think we can make that is like, this is going to make the big change, right? And so that's how I've at least come to justify success for my project, is if the audiences that I want to use it see value in the tool that has been made once it is at the point of done, whatever we want to call that. But I don't know if Burju or Paul wants to jump in at all here.
I could jump for a quick answer. This was my dilemma for my whole PhD research, actually. Like this question was keeping me awake at night. So like, for example, with AI, especially because my initial concept for this, my idea for this is that as any technology emerged throughout the history, this is inevitable. It's going to be used. But 4 years ago, when I started this project, I was very optimistic about the use of AI and how we are going to use it for good. You know, it's going to change a lot of things. It's going to facilitate a lot of things. And now I'm at the end of my PhD, and we are seeing all these uses of ChatGPT. People are asking very silly questions. They're using it for as if they are and just their romantic partners and so on, like very silly. But of course, like as I did in my studies, that just to use it for something good and for the environment, because it's going to be used, but it's not that only itself is not enough. Of course, the impact needs to worth it to begin with. So also renewable energy, and there are a lot of studies happening in the also hardware development, hardware engineering. Like they're building all these new technologies to like consume less energy, and yeah, these are all like needs to be combined together to like it's not only one aspect, is all of them together.
Thank you. Just for time, we're gonna move to Paul, and then is there a question online?
There is a question
okay,
online.
so
You kind of covered it a little bit, but
Paul will answer, then we'll come to the online one.
Okay.
Awesome.
There's a lot to unpack there, and so I'm not going to give a long-winded answer. But it reminds me a little bit about, in relation to, you're creating a game that is meant to promote ideas about, sort of being ecological, and you may be actually creating more damage in the creation and production and use of the game than in the benefit that it produces in the long run. It's like ecotourism, right? Ecotourism is don't go. Ecotourism is stay home, right? Because for all the reasons that we know, for flights, for impact, all that kind of thing. I don't know if it's a clear analogy, and if there's significant positive consequences, then maybe it offsets what the carbon footprint of creating the game and using it. But in terms of learning, that's the $1 million question in the serious games world, right? Because one thing is most measures that are done around games for their efficacy are very shortly after the player has played. There's very, very few, if any, long-term studies around the use and impact of a game. And the other thing is, even if, and the second thing is, never trust anybody in terms of what they say about themselves and how they feel. And because they may be well-intentioned, it may be honest, but sometimes you're blind to yourself. And sometimes you don't actually realize, the truth about what you're saying. And so I know from my studies that, it's important to take in user, feedback or user comments on their use of the game, but you can't take it as orthodox. You can't take it for face value. And then the other thing is, you can say that they learned something, like, oh, they've learned something, they've moved the needle, they're now aware that they have to plant trees in Afghanistan. The next thing is, well, what did they do about it? Like, is there action that is consequent to the learning? And so that I think is very, well, in some ways it's actually easy to measure. Like, for example, in our board game, where we're trying to get NGO leaders to implement a methodology to better protect victims in war zones, in a few years, it's very easy to revisit those leaders and to say, well, did they actually use the methodology? And that would measure the success of the game, if anybody bothers to want to know that. But I think it's very difficult and expensive to run those types of studies. And in a studio like mine, where the budget allotted to the game is pretty much the budget, there's no budget to measure for efficacy. In some institutions, they build that into the budget because part of their mandate from their donor or their financial source demands that you prove that the game worked. But I'm always a little suspicious of the kinds of measures and metrics that are used to measure the success of the game. I know I sound a little bit cynical because I do think that they have impact, and I do think that you can actually change attitudes and behaviors with interactivity. I just think at this point it's a little bit messy, and we haven't quite nailed a way to do it that is really convincing to me, especially in terms of the lack of long-term studies.
You said there was a connected online question to this.
yeah, I think some of you have spoken to it already, but I'll read it out. It's from Madeline. I have a question about the learning that you, as game designers, get from your outcomes of your games. Example, if you're able to observe or to capture them, and what you do with that learning afterwards.
So do we want to sit a little bit more on that question of like, how do we actually assess learning in that space? Which I think is a somewhat loaded question that all education kind of sits with, of like, what does education assessment look like, right? Like the average classroom, they have their curriculum goals, they then boil them down into rubrics and grading spreadsheets, and they mark them from there. And I think a lot of serious games, educational games, come out of a similar structure, at least inherently, especially with serious games as a movement in its resurgence, perhaps, comes out of trying to reorient the American education system. If we look at like Clark App's work, you see games follow a similar thing, where like some of those games that I would quote unquote call like gamification or edutainment, or like bad games sometimes, as people in the space will call them, they fall into these like worksheet style, rubric style games where you can just check off, did the player choose this option or this option? Did the player do this or that, right? And in my head, is that, are we learning, or are we just confirming that they're able to regurgitate points that you've distilled to them? And I think like learning as a concept, knowledge as a concept, knowledge translation, I mean, these are large questions of how do we assess them. And because games, especially when I would argue an effective or well-designed game is doing it, it's doing it through a lot of nuance. It's doing it through, as Paul was saying earlier, kind of the mechanics that are happening in the game to reflect that action. It comes to the ideologies that are actually distilled into the game, both socially in how we talk at a table, but also in the texts that are in the game itself. And so to your question, Madeline, of like, how do we, assess this learning? I actually think it's very project and site specific, where I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm going to use qualitative methods to try to evaluate some form of learning in that space. But never will I say my game can successfully teach everyone to not be disinformed, because that's never a claim that I can ever make, no matter how proud I am of the product that I've made. I don't know if others want to jump in on that or add anything else. You said it pretty well. Just trying to kind of summarize. Was there another question in the audience? Anywhere. I think I see a hand.
There is a hand right here.
So with like the advent of serious games and games that are kind of meant to express like art or narrative instead of just pure entertainment, do you think that more people will come to recognize analog games and video games as mediums, just like books or film? Or do you think people will continue to view them as solely for entertainment?
I saw your hand, Paul.
I'll quote Marshall McLuhan to start again. I could quote Marshall McLuhan every day. Such a great guy. He said at one point, and I'm paraphrasing, if anybody who makes a distinction between education and entertainment doesn't know anything about either. And I don't know if it's true. It's a provocative statement. He liked to provoke, right? It wasn't always sort of intellectually honest, more provocative. But I think we're living in the age of games right now. And it's not an economic or market-driven sort of phenomenon. I think the argument can be made that when we were living in a factory culture, right, and the central mode of production, industrial modes, produced industrial arts, right? So film is an industrial art. The reel operates like an assembly line, and the way that it functions is mechanical. So now we've moved the center of production from the factory to the computer. And the computer, it creates, the industrial model left its template on all of our institutions. Schools are produced in an industrial fashion. Offices, hospitals, and prisons all follow a template that is born of the Industrial Revolution. So as we move into the digital realm, where computers are numeric rule-based entities, games are numeric rule-based entities. There's an argument that can be made that games are actually the artistic expression of a digital age. Because if you look at things like, what are games? They're participatory, they differentiate, they're dynamic. These are all elements that are born of and afforded by the internet, computers, all this type of thing. And when you look at the video game in itself, I think it is absolutely the art form of the 21st century. It's the grand opera of art. Every single art form that has ever existed is consolidated in the video game. You can't photography, dance, it's all in there, everything. I mean, maybe you can think of one that isn't. I haven't been able to. So I think that games are not trivial at this point in time. That's why they are the single largest medium in the US. I mean, the most bandied statistic is that they sell more than film and music combined in the US. And then you would think, well, all the kids are playing video games, so nobody's playing board games. Never have board games been more popular and more types of board games been played, right? No, everybody, just look at a Subway. Everybody's on their mobile phones. So I think there's something particular and specific about games and the era that we're living in. And for that reason, games teach us about the world that we're living in. That's why it's not just in education, it's not just about using a game in education. It's not by using a game in a classroom, it's learning how to make education better by understanding how games work and taking those systems and applying them at a systemic level. Because if we're talking about change, real change, that happens at the systems level, not at the content level. And I think that, I'm not a utopian. Maybe the games will lead us in another type of nightmare than the Industrial Revolution has bestowed on us, but they're certainly anticipatory of the world that we're moving into.
I think there's a Black Mirror episode on games.
I think it's called 10 million credits or something. There's 3 or 4. Yeah.
But did anybody else want to address the question? Is it a yes nod or just a?
I'm like ambivalent.
Yeah, give us some thoughts.
Because I think it's already here, and I can see when I started doing Games for Change in 2016, just in my little reality, I could see that people were confused. What are you doing? It doesn't make sense. And now it's better. It seems to make more sense but that's like not that relevant as an answer because it's limited to my perception, but I can see it's already here. But I think it will only succeed if we allow ourselves to make games or playthings that are breaking the expectation that entertainment built around what games are supposed to be. Because in my reflection about how to use games for social transformation, I came to the realization through my work that social transformation will only happen if we not only happen, but requires us to be comfortable in discomfort and be comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty and chaos and some level of breaking the rules. And I think that's where Games for Impact can bring us. Non-entertainment games or non-entertainment play allow us to explore not lack of structure or comfort in ambiguity, but we need to then accept as game makers, we need to, I think, be open to making games that are not games as we imagine them to be, that the rules are breaking, that the object is imperfect, and that, so yeah, I think it only works if we give ourselves more room to be experimental.
I think that's also a great pitch for CGSA this year, which topic is breaking, or it breaks, I think. So just for anyone sticking around for the conference this weekend, it's a very nice promo for it as well. I think I saw another hand in the audience. And to the Fourspace team, we still have time for this question. We're still good, I think. Yeah, okay.
So the Marshall McLuhan code kind of stuck in my head. The medium is the message, the medium, something like that. Sorry. My question is there a point where the gameplay kind of overshadowed the message or vice versa? How do you strike a balance between the message that you're trying to put out and the gameplay itself? Is there a point where it's too much fun, it's overshadowed the message, or is too much of the message you feel like a PowerPoint more than a game? Thank you.
I just, Burju or Kara, we both all answered the last question. Either of you want to start answering this question? I see a head nod from Burju, so I'm gonna ask that you.
Yeah, I struggled with this a lot because I also wanted to, like, in my game, there was also a time limit that I needed to like attract people in a short period of time. But I think it needs like short answer, it needs a balance. between like not one should overthrow the other, which at least I found about my project.
Yeah, there definitely is like a piece of balance there. Did you want to add, or anyone else want to add to that? Please go ahead. No.
I sincerely.
Yeah, we also see it. Yeah.
In hearing your question, I was just offering the other people answer because I think they might be more suited. But in hearing your question, I was thinking about a previous game that I was working on called Unearth You, and it came out in 2021. And this game kind of took on the appearance of a wellness app. And I was kind of taking on some of the common themes that you would see, like kind of habit tracking and doing meditations on your phone and some journaling. And it kind of, it's a very experimental game, and it also uses found footage like my previous game and has themes of environmentalism. But when I found that when I was doing playtesting for it, when people would first play it, it just struck people as like so critical that I think it lost like some of the audience at the beginning. But then the end is much, maybe I should say more about the game, but the game follows this like fake AI who's guiding you through this sort of wellness journey. And so it presents itself as if it is a wellness app. But then as the story goes on, you learn more about that AI and how she was made. And the game starts to kind of deconstruct the kind of our expectations of wellness and like what that should look like. But that it does offer something, like some things still stick around, and it still offers like if you the meditations, or still offers the reflections. And so at the beginning, in playtesting it, lots of people found like, oh, it's too critical of the wellness industry at the time, you know, when I was making it, that it lost some of the audience there. But then later on, for people who were down for that, it kind of didn't want to engage in the things that I genuinely thought it was offering, and kind of like a relation to your phone in a different way than kind of these habit trackers often demand of you. And so that's just what I thought of when I heard your question.
Don't fight over it all.
I'm always worried about talking too much. So I think that's again, it's the balance that all serious game designers, learning game designers struggle with, is that balance between the game part and the content part. And I think that there's no formula, there's no magic formula. I think it's through the magic of iteration and playtesting. That's what it does. It's like, as long as you've hit the point where you've collectively decided that whatever the learning is that has to be accomplished is in some way being transmitted, and that while people play, they're smiling and having fun and wanting to continue to play. And if those two things seem to be coexisting in a way that is functional and serviceable, I think you've struck that balance. But I've yet to discover like a formula for achieving that, other than trying an idea, trying it out, playing through it, and arriving at something functional.
Just on that note, if we had a formula for design, then I don't think games would be what they are today. And I think earlier points around kind of entertainment industry, as Julie was saying, like kind of formalizing or institutionalizing this, they kind of try to have a formula. Like Call of Duty has a formula where every Call of Duty game looks the same. And I feel like it does a detriment to what those games could be. And I would encourage us almost not to make a formula, even if there was one. I recognize we're coming near the end of our time, so I'm going to ask one final question to the panelists to kind of close off the conversation today. But obviously, we're going to be here after this, where the games that they've made and others is going to be in the space for the next hour after this panel. And please encourage you to stay and play those games after the conversation today. But I want to reflect on kind of the whole conversation we had here today, which is always nice to do when you close off a panel. And each of us has similarities and differences in the games that we've either worked on or have talked about here today. And I want you to think about those projects or the projects you have mentioned, and what are the core challenges that are kind of holding back serious games? I think some of them came out in the conversations today, but I think for people who are interested in getting into this space, or people who have been in this space for a while, like what are actually the core challenges you're seeing in this world of making serious games, whatever you want to define serious games as in your work. And I've made Burju start every time, so I'm going to have Burju close us off instead. I'm going to start with Julie this time to put you, I know, in the immediate hot seat. But yeah, what are kind of the core challenges in this space?
There's two. The first one is the one I mentioned before about like not allowing ourselves as designers to make experimental games and unpolished and like breaking the rules and leaning with ambiguity and with the gameplay and experience. That's one. For me, the other one is making games and playful experiences that are safe and inclusive, which is really hard to do. And it's a limitation that I realized about my work fairly recently, where I thought that I could use play as a way to make people have hard conversations about complex social issues. You bring people in a room, they're sitting together, you make them play something, so they're gonna think and talk about that thing, that conversation, and it's gonna flatten the power dynamics between them because they're playing, so everyone's gonna be able to be involved equally in the conversation. And I used to think that games or play could flatten the dynamics, and then I realized that it's not true, and that the people who are allowed in a room at work or in the classroom, even if they're playing, they're the loudest still. And so it's often the same people who take the same space in the conversation, regardless of if you're playing a game or not. And I think if we, as designers, if we don't take the responsibility of observing those patterns and seeing that the game does not flatten those power dynamics, we are limiting what those games can do. Because what happened in my work is I'm making these people play a city builder, and I'm asking them to talk about things that they care about. I'm like, what is a sustainable city, and what do you want your sustainable city to be like? What do you want your future reality to be? And so it's personal to them, but not everyone is talking equally. And so I realized that it was hurting some of them, keeping some of these people quiet. And so in that situation, then this experience is useless because it's not involving everyone in the conversation. And I think that's a big limitation, is believing that play is safe inherently. And I'm hoping that as like a collective, we realize that it's not, and that we're critical in the conversations that we have around how do we make safe and constructive and inclusive playful experiences. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
For me, the core challenge that I'm thinking through is, such a focus on the users, and I'm growing interest in the production, right? Of how can we change the production process of making these games to be more in line with what we actually want to see happen in the world. So, and that's beyond kind of using renewable energy, but also thinking through the structures of how games are made, like moving more towards co-ops or unionizing existing game studios, and thinking about how serious games are made in academic settings, which the way that they're made and the way they're studied, I think can often be exploitative of grad students. And so I would want more focus on this world of serious games to be kind of on how are we actually making the games, and supporting certain ethics and the problems that we actually want to address and affect in our users. How can we actually do that, rather than kind of hoping that it affects the users in some way?
It's a great question. It's an important question. So I think on one hand, there's just the economic realities around serious games. Like, it's so hard to make a career in serious games. The options are limited. The market is limited. It's not a commercially or market-driven type of game design. It's largely supported by grants and academic institutions. So it's a hustle. Right? And you have to be resilient, and you have to be willing to hustle, and you have to love it and put yourself out there. And I think that's a huge challenge. I think that it's important to remember that, we talk about the big questions around, are these games actually making a difference, right? Are they changing the world? Are they leading to action? And I will remind you that it's not just the act of somebody playing the game that may have an impact or not have an impact, but I will say it's really important to remember that making the game can be transformational, and that as game makers we change in making the game, and there's whenever, especially if you're a teacher or somebody who's in a mentorship role, get people to make games, have game jams, because those conversations and the thinking that goes around the creation of games can be just as important, if not more important, than the product and the effect it has on the player. And then lastly, especially in the realm of digital games, it's the digital divide, access to technology, access to Wi-Fi. Sometimes the people that most need to hear the message or most benefit from the learning just don't have access to it because they don't have the technology or the conditions, the economic conditions to access play, which in many parts of the world is a luxury.
I'm just going to briefly add that for myself, one of the challenges I think is also literacy, and I mean that very holistically, and I know it's a loaded term, but there is a kind of sense that, to some of the points that I think people are bringing up, if you have audiences that don't know what games are, and so you have to design for their ability. But you also have educators that don't know what games are, so they feel scared to use them in their classrooms. You have expectations from players that games will look a certain way, and when they don't, they might refuse to engage. And you have expectations from designers and teachers that can be kind of contradictory about how visible the learning goals have to be. And so I think all of that to me comes from like an understanding of game literacy, play literacy, ludo literacies if you're in the game studies field, and that's a term you want to use, that I think is actually a weak point for the serious games movement, because entertainment games have built such a strong kind of space for themselves that serious games kind of not sits juxtaposed to, but kind of leeches off those literacies in a way that is sometimes detrimental to their success in those spaces. But Burju, why don't you wrap us off?
Well, for me, the whole project was a challenge because this was the first time that I'm designing a game. But the major challenge was the lack of financial support, honestly, at the university. We all could agree on this. And also the prototyping was challenging for me. So I used the Wizard of Oz prototyping where we imitated the game mechanics in analog format. This was very challenging for me to translate it into the digital. So some things lost in translation, some things were unnecessary to design in analog. So I wasted a lot of time on taking the wrong angles to the project. And I also learned from the hard way that I think for serious games to reach their potential, we need to think more holistically about systems, ethics, and also the lived experience of the players, like to understand their experience and design better games for them.
So with that, thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Also, a piece to keep in mind is that to make these games good, we should play them. And so as a segue to the next part is we have, I think it's 8 games right now set up in the room. I think maybe it's a 9th if you count the game I have here on the table. I would encourage you all to take some time over the next hour to play those games. During that hour, there will be some people walking around with microphones interviewing some of these designers live, just to, because we're going to compile it into a podcast post talking about their games and how they came to be. So if you see that, they might interrupt your conversation. It's not an offense against you. It's they have to get the podcast through before we close today. Nevertheless, we encourage you to play those games. But before that, I want to thank the panelists again for your time and energy for being here, and to the ForSpace for making sure this event could happen and coordinating it all, because you've done a fantastic job, and we're deeply, deeply appreciative. So if we can just have a round of applause for everyone here. And so I pass the torch to the ForSpace to close off the Zoom.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everyone, for coming in. Your questions, everything, that part was the best part for us, having that conversation. Just gonna let you know, we're gonna close up the Zoom and the live stream now. This conversation remains available on our YouTube channel. Of course, you will share it. But you also have a wonderful weekend. Stick around and play these games.